Barry Marcus. It's great to be talking with you. So not too long ago, you wrote a piece for us about deep learning and artificial intelligence. And when I reached out to you to write about it, I had asked you to write about an AI competition that you had commented on. And we were planning on writing something like maybe 2,500, 3,000 words, but you sent me, I think it was like 8,000 words, so a pretty big piece. So tell me why were you interested in writing the piece, and what inspired you to go to that length?
Well, I mean, you asked me to write about symbol systems and why they had won the NetHack competition and what that meant. And I realized that most people don't even know what a symbol system is or why you would want one. Most people today mostly only know about the neural networks that are popular, don't really have context to understand why anybody would do anything different. And I'm a bit frustrated by that. I think that there's being an enormous amount of investment in an approach that I don't think by itself can work. And I've also been kind of discouraged by the kind of posture that the deep learning community's taken. So I think there's a lot of good work in that field. There's a lot of useful things there, but I also think that people are missing a historical perspective, and they're sort of like the old metaphor to a person who has a hammer, everything is a nail. And it's hard to explain that in 2,000 words. You know, if I wrote a 2,000 word piece, I would explain, hey, symbols won, and isn't that surprising? And people would be none the wiser about what's going on. The piece that I did write made some people wiser, but maybe not the people that I would have hoped it would make wiser, because the people that I hoped it would make wiser never really got past the title, as far as I can tell. So the title was Deep Learning is Hitting a Wall. Not Deep Learning has hit a wall, but is hitting a wall. And I still believe that to be true. We're now, I don't know, a month or two later, and a couple even bigger deep learning papers have come out. DALL-E 2 and PaLM have made a big splash. And to the people deeply embedded in the deep learning community, that's proof that deep learning has not hit a wall. Deep learning is in fact stuck exactly in the places that I talked about in the article. It continues to be stuck there, even with these flashier results. So DALL-E, was not in the piece because it wasn't out yet. DALL-E 2 wasn't out. To the leaders at OpenAI, this is proof that there's no hitting a wall. And in fact, Greg Brockman, who's the CTO, took some pot shots at me. The CTO of OpenAI that released DALL-E 2 took some pot shots at me, and so did Sam Altman, who's the CEO of OpenAI. It's kind of a big deal when like the head of a big company attacks you on Twitter and doesn't bother to tag you, is sort of taking cheap shots, but that's what they did. And Brockman's cheap shot was to show a picture that DALL-E had generated of the phrase deep learning is hitting a wall. And the thing is, that's kind of funny, ha ha ha. But you look at it carefully and it says deep learning, not deep learning, which is actually symptomatic of a really deep problem that I've been talking about for 20 some years, which is these systems can't do basic things like generalize the identity function. If I tell you this word on the input, I want it on the output. Instead, it kind of botched that and came up with deep learning. And then, is it hitting a wall? Well, it's on a brick wall that maybe has some cracks, but it's not really clear that there's actually any hitting there. And if you look around at what DALL-E is doing, it often takes like a few key phrases in a sentence and it draws those, but then leaves out others. And so compositionality, being able to understand language in terms of its parts, or maybe an image in terms of its parts, it's an idea that goes back to Frege, that you can understand the meaning of a whole by integrating the parts. That's still a problem for these systems. And that's the kind of thing that I was talking about in the article. The article was filled with examples of GPT-3 having problems with this, where it doesn't really understand the things that it's saying in terms of the pieces that are there. And so, and in terms of how they relate to one another in discourse. So like if GPT-3 recommends that someone commit suicide, GPT-3 is not actually understanding the relation between the words that it's saying, I think you should, and the meaning in the context of the discourse that's there. Think you should what? And the system's just not putting that together. And I said, that's a problem a couple of months ago. And there's this triumphalism that, oh, we can draw great pictures, but those systems have the same problems. They still have the problem of they don't really understand the meaning of something as a whole. And drawing little pieces of it is really like a cut and paste job. It's a beautiful cut and paste job. It's the best thing I've ever seen in that sense, but it is not solving this wall of getting systems to reliably understand meanings in terms of their parts, in terms of their connections with the discourse and so forth. So there's lots of kind of laughing the deep learning community, like Joshua Bach, had a funny image of a robot stomping over a bunch of walls and said, deep learning isn't just hitting a wall, it's crushing them. I mean, there's been a lot of kind of in-jokes around it, but the reality is the walls I was talking about haven't really been addressed. So there is no serious reply to it. And it's not a good thing when you have an intellectual community of people that doesn't read criticism beyond the title. Like, this is not a healthy sign. And part of the article was in fact about how that field has been unhealthy for some time. It's been full of bravado, which we kind of portrayed in the first paragraph. And it's been oftentimes filled with people not listening to each other in either direction. And honestly, the response of the article is just another illustration of that. And then the other thing that's happened since the article is I didn't stress that much the kind of poor state of the science that is done in deep learning on occasion, not by everybody, but there was like a big step back, in my opinion, just in the last few weeks, which is we have regressed from the field that has become more sophisticated about recognizing that replicability is the most important thing in a science, to a field that just wants to wave flags and say, hey, we did it, without looking at how and without looking at whether it's replicable. So, the one paper I really wish I had cited in the article, if I were doing a revised edition, is this article by Joël Pineau on replicability in machine learning. And you probably know about the replicability crisis that psychology has had and medicine has had. Well, machine learning is just begging for that. And Pineau made this wonderful checklist of things you should do, which start with like fully disclose what the data are, because these systems are functions from training data to generalization. So be candid about what your data are so people could figure out how to replicate it. Try to replicate it yourself. Give numbers for things. Don't just give anecdotal data. All of this is like true in science in general. And she did a really terrific job of making this checklist that people should use as a checklist, like when you're flying a plane, right? You don't fly a plane without, looking at your checklist, because memory is fallible and you get caught up in the moment. Well, you shouldn't be flying an AI system without looking at her checklist. And both the big paper by Google and the big paper by OpenAI had a lot of missed boxes on that checklist. So Google has this thing that supposedly understands jokes. But you read the paper and you read the details carefully. This is the Palm model. And it doesn't actually tell you what they tried. And it doesn't tell you what didn't work. And I'm sure it didn't work always, because there's no AI that works always on any general problem. But they don't disclose. So they give a numerator. These cases worked. They don't even count. They give anecdotal evidence, and they don't give a denominator. Did they try 100, 1,000? Did they try a bunch of different kinds of jokes? Would it work with Stephen Wright's jokes, which work very differently from, Henny Youngman's jokes? We don't know. And the scientific community went silent. They didn't call Google out for doing what was basically PR. Another thing in that paper that was basically PR was they gave examples of things they got right that earlier systems didn't, without giving any examples of what the new system got wrong. That's just advertising. That's not science. And nobody spoke up, or almost nobody spoke up. I saw one nice tweet by Andrej Karpathy speaking up on another aspect of it. So one of the things that OpenAI did is they didn't allow public access. And instead, they advertised it basically with tweets. Sam Altman said, give me an example and I'll tweet it. Now, do you think he's going to tweet the failures as well as the positive cases? Well, you don't even know if that's all the data are you have. And the scientific community should be really upset. Karpathy is the only person besides me who protested. And then the other problem with that paper, sorry, just stop, is they don't tell you what data they trained it on. They write, we trained the model on examples of images and text from a variety of licensed and public sources or something like that. It's almost a verbatim quote. They don't tell you, like, was it a million, a billion, a trillion? They don't tell you, were they clip art? Were they, you just don't know anything. And so it's fine for companies to work on private models. I have no problem with that. I mean, business can do what it wants. But when you put that stuff in the scientific domain, and when the scientific community treats it as if it's science, and you don't follow the basic principles of science, you have a problem.
So talk a little bit more about that seeming problem of transparency in AI. There seems to be a problem in transparency where private companies are advertising, as you say, their results as science in AI, but then also there's a problem in transparency with the technology of deep learning itself, where it's not clear how it's coming to the decisions that it does, correct?
It's nice that places like Google and OpenAI publish some of their results, but if you want to treat it as science, you really need to do the things that are part of science. Otherwise, it becomes publicity and it distorts the scientific process. And I think that there's a problem there. Then there's a whole separate question, which is, are the models transparent? Do you know what they're doing and how and why? Well, if you don't know what the training set is, and you only know what the output is, given the nature of these models, you just don't know very much. Because the core problem, which we talked about in the essay, is really about generalization. So at one extreme, you could have a model that only memorizes the things that it's seen before, never goes beyond it. Another extreme, you could have something that's very fluid and almost truly intelligent that could generalize in all kinds of different ways. Then you have things that are in between, and most neural networks are in between. So they generalize to things that are similar to what they've seen before, but they have trouble as you go out into the long tail of things that are more distant. And this has been true for 20 some years. It's still true. A good example from Tesla is, which I believe we had in the article, was a Tesla in autopilot mode, driving towards a human being who was in the middle of a road carrying a stop sign. So that human being didn't look like the average pedestrian because it had the stop sign in its hand. And it didn't look like the average stop sign because it wasn't on the side of the road where they usually are. But to you or me, if we saw that, we would realize this is sort of like a construction worker, a safety worker, or whatever. They're telling me to stop. I better slow down. No human, reasonable human would hesitate. But the system didn't get it because it didn't match its kind of memorized library. It does a little better than memorization. So, it could recognize people maybe with different color clothes than it had seen before. But it was so far from what it had been trained on to have a person carrying a stop sign that it just had no idea. And it couldn't reason about it. There was no part of the system that said, here's person, here's stop sign. What should we do if we see the two together? It's probably, I don't know the details of their system, but my guess from looking at similar systems is they probably just have narrow categories like person, stop sign. It didn't really fit into either. And because it's not transparent to the rest of the system, how it gets there, what the quality of the evidence is, etc., it's a problem. And this is generally a problem across all these systems. Fundamentally, the way GPT-3 is trained is to predict the next word in a sentence. Well, when I type on my iPhone a text message and it predicts the next word, it doesn't mean that it knows anything at all about what the next word is. It just knows that a lot of people have typed similar messages. And if I have typed the letters TWE, maybe I'm about to type the word 20, because statistically, when people have typed TWE in this context, that's what I get. Doesn't mean the system knows that that's a number or anything like that. That's basically what we have right now, are systems that are autocomplete tools that are getting wildly misused. There's nothing wrong with autocomplete. And, OpenAI has made the best version of autocomplete known to humanity, but then it gets misapplied to things that it's really not cut out for.
What do you think it's going to take for the deep learning and wider AI community to confront these challenges that you've outlined for the technology? I mean,
well, I think there are a few different answers. One is, the people in power don't want to read it. They want to keep their power. They don't want other people to read it either, and they try to do that. But some other people do read it. So, my biggest hope, and I don't think it's an unrealistic one, is that some of the younger generation will say, "Hey, what's this fuss about? Like, what are the two sides to this argument, and how can we do better?" I always say about science, I'm short-term pessimist, long-term optimist. Science is self-correcting. In the short term, politics can matter a lot. And I think that's what we're seeing in deep learning is you have people that are investing enormous amount of money, have the resources. So of course their results look the best in the short term when they're outspending the other guys 1,000 to 1. But that doesn't mean it's right in the long term. And in the long term, it's just not good enough to solve a bunch of problems. Particularly around reliability, misinformation, and so forth. And so there is economic and social pressure to do better. And, it doesn't necessarily happen in a day, and there might be a lot of energy wasted. Sometimes there's a delay of 15 or 20 years, or, people waste a lot of money. And it's not just money, right? It's that the smartest young people go where all the buzz is, and could have been doing something else. That's what happened with brain imaging, and I wish a lot of those bright young kids had done other things. But eventually science does self-correct. Eventually you realize you are hitting a wall. Maybe some people shout from the outside and you don't listen to them, but eventually even internally you're just not getting the results you want. So like the driverless car industry wants results, and at some point they are going to realize that throwing more and more data at the problem does not solve it. That's part of why Karpathy, I'm speculating, Karpathy is taking a 4-month leave. He thought he could solve this problem with more data. And he set up, I'm guessing, I'm speculating. He set up the best data acquisition pipeline that I think anybody can imagine. He gives a brilliant talk about this. So, Tesla's doing a wonderful job gathering data, but that has not made the cars really be able to do what we call level 5 self-driving, of like you type in where you want to go and the car figures it out and takes you there. Like, I think, Musk thought we were going to get that done in 2016. I did an interview with John Brockman's Edge in 2016 and said, you're deluding yourself. It's not going to happen. It's much harder. And so, I might, if he'd listened to me, maybe to save a few years of effort, but eventually, like Musk himself has lately said, oh, well, driving is a, it's basically requires complete general intelligence. It's not something we can solve with narrow domain stuff. He almost said that in his TED interview, which is what I was trying to tell him all along. It took him a while to figure it out, and he probably spent N billion dollars going down what I think is not an adequate path. Not that all the effort is wasted, but it didn't lead where he expected to go. But eventually people realized, like, it's still enormously economically valuable to build driverless cars, and it's enormously moral thing to do if done right, because it'll save a lot of lives. And so, like, people aren't just going to give up. Eventually they're going to realize that what they're doing is not as powerful as they thought.
Where do you think is the most promising area for the hybrid models that you recommend to come in and do something really surprising or spectacular?
It's a good question. I think we haven't figured out the killer short-term app. I do like this stuff that AI21 is doing, where you can answer kind of general queries that you might wish Google could answer and get them reliably. I think that I like what they're up to. I want to see in more detail how well it works, but maybe the short-term application is something like that. It's kind of generalized question answering. In the long term, I don't think we can solve high quality language translation without neurosymbolic approaches, and I've started to see people in that field say that. I don't think we can do real-time language translation like Babelfish, if you know Hitchhiker's Guide, without neurosymbolic approaches. But it isn't just neurosymbolic techniques that we need. We need to have large-scale knowledge databases and better engineering techniques. So it's not going to be like, on Tuesday, somebody finally figures out the right neurosymbolic interface, and on Wednesday, AI is solved. Like, there's a lot of work to be done. And we may not see those killer apps for some time.
All right, Gary Marcus, thanks so much for your time and talking about your article.
Thanks very much for inviting me to write it and inviting me to talk about it some more after the fact.